Fresno, Fresno, that's my hometown. Fresno, Fresno, that's my hometown.
Welcome back to The Place of Places, a chapter-by-chapter analysis of William Saroyan's 1972 memoir, Places Where I've Done Time. Today, we visit Ahboud's stand at the Fresno Free Market, 1917. Here, we take another journey back to the early 20th century, a time Saroyan is nostalgic for even as his family struggled to make ends meet in Fresno. In this chapter, he finds work with various weekend vendors at the Fresno Free Market, an open-air market akin to today's farmers markets. First, he works for Long John, an Armenian, and then he tries another fruit vendor, Ahboud. He guesses from the language Ahboud speaks that the man is Syrian or Lebanese and is speaking Arabic to others. For a day's work shining oranges, picking out the rotten fruit, and calling out to customers, young Willie gets paid a silver dollar, which he considers generous payment. And so he would go back on Saturdays to work for Ahboud, a man he respected. This is something of a departure for Saroyan, who often doesn't have very positive things to say about the adults in his life. From the Marmish teachers and school administrators, who he felt harbored racial prejudices, to his own mother and uncle, who he felt didn't believe in him early on, the adults in his life made him want to leave Fresno at 17. Of course, there were exceptions to this list, including his uncle Miron and a handful of young teachers. But he felt an adult needed to earn his respect, which wasn't popular among his elders. However, this story is so sweet that it might have found a place in the collection My Name is Aram. But it's interesting that the hero of the story isn't an Armenian man. Rather, he is an Arab man, not the typical father figure in Willie's life at the time. But living in Fresno exposed the community to many different cultures. And at the time in America, this type of diversity was mostly available in either in the large northeast cities or in California. He also remarks that Ahboud sold his soft tomatoes in bulk to women who would turn it into salsa, which was a sort of tomato paste used by Armenians. And he also mentions this dish elsewhere in interviews. Incidentally, the tomato paste was called salcha in Turkey, and it originally made its way to Armenia from its native home in Latin America in the 1800s. So it was sort of a coming home for Armenian salsa to be back in Fresno, back in the Western Hemisphere where the Aztecs first grew tomatoes in southern Mexico. And here too we see the importance of food in his life, and really in all of our lives. Saroyan used food throughout his entire career to symbolize family and intimacy. Of course, it's a huge aspect of his song, Come On to My House, in which the singer attempts to seduce someone with fruit. Naturally, food, as a major driver for all living things, has been used as a symbol of life and knowledge since the first words were written. And though we don't often think of Saroyan as a symbolic writer, there are certain themes that do frequently appear in his work, and one of them is the significance of life-giving food. As the son of a preacher and from a family that went to church, he was exposed to the symbolism of fruit in the Bible as a child. And that may have been particularly impactful for a smart kid living in an agricultural place where fruit trees abounded. The trees of knowledge surrounded him in Fresno, at the vineyards he and his family worked at, and in the way the entire town was consumed by the business of fruit. In the case of family and intimacy, fruit regularly symbolized fatherhood in his works. From a young adulthood, he was concerned about creating an heir. When he accomplished this, the reality was perhaps more challenging than the concept. But as a symbol, it was powerful in his stories. At the same time, while fruit represented fertility, he was also concerned with rot. Many of Saroyan's early stories were fairly dour, focusing on survival during the Depression. In these stories, there is plentiful imagery of fruit rot, and as he also became concerned with his own brain, the bad choices he knew he made, the madness in his family, he also made comparisons to rot. Fruit consumed his life in Fresno, and when the boys around town weren't selling papers, they often went to work at the stalls in the free market. The free market was set up near Courthouse Park on Fresno Street, beginning around 1910. The park was historically a popular gathering place in Fresno and a sort of city center. Local farmers would sell their fruits and vegetables, and even live animals were sold there. In 1952, the market was moved by the city, and it began its slow slide into oblivion, effectively gone by the 1980s. In 1915, around the time of Saroyan's story, the free market had nearly 100 vendor stands and was a thriving staple in town. A 1915 Fresno Morning Republican explained that meat prices had been high in town until farmers began bringing their pre-slaughtered meat to the free market. This attracted buyers and took down the stable butcher industry in town that was keeping prices high. The market was open 3 days a week, on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, but of course the weekend is when the boys could help the vendors. The market struggled for its first 2 years, as the Merchants Association, butchers, and others objected to it bringing down prices. Then it was threatened again in 1927. Not only did the free market's open access disrupt regular business, but it was largely populated by immigrant vendors and patrons. Armenians were a large percentage of these as well, and for many immigrants it harkened back to the open-air markets from their home countries, where bartering was also more acceptable. The free market would have been a much more welcoming place to newcomers than the button-down storefronts that were gatekeepers of the retail industry. Saroyan would also work at stands later in his life. He notes that once south of Market in San Francisco, he worked for an Armenian fruit seller after returning from New York in 1929. He also worked briefly at stands at the Crystal Market in San Francisco. These were comfortable, familiar places for him to be, and good places to make a little money during the Depression, as he sought to become a professional writer. As I worked, I was free to think, and I did a good deal of it, or perhaps thinking isn't quite the word I want, although dreaming isn't either, a kind of mixture of both. The play that got away, from The Whole Boiled and Other Stories, published in 1957, describes his time working at the Crystal Palace Market in San Francisco. On Saturdays, he would glory in working at the stalls, cleaning and selling fruit and vegetables from the various immigrant vendors, and the rest of the week he would look for office work. But the market was like a theater to him, with comedy and tragedy abounding and characters of every sort. He was already drawn to theatrical moments, though it would be many years until he wrote and produced a play. Like the bars and gambling joints around town, every type of person would gather at the fruit stalls and display their character for him to write down happily. Though this chapter seems unassuming, it allows us to delve into the major influences on his writing, from both his quality of capturing modernism and realism to metaphorical symbols that reappeared throughout his work. Let's put this on the Saroyan map and move on.